Hello and welcome back to Tanya Talks. Today, I wanted to have a conversation about really the families that aren't just falling apart, but being pushed apart. Think about social media, therapy trends, the language that's really just so normalized in any room that you walk into now. And really what's being promoted culturally right now as healing. But we have to ask ourselves, is that really healing? When you're scrolling through social media for 5 minutes, what do you see? Seven signs that your parent is a narcissist, emotionally immature parents. If your child cut you off, it's your fault. How to go no contact and never look back. Like, you can see the pattern of disconnection that is happening in our culture. And the more disconnected people are from their roots and the people closest to them and their family, the easier they are to be manipulated, divided, influenced, all kinds of things that actually starts to become rather scary because it's always about creating a victim versus villain mentality, which means I'm the victim because I was done wrong, and they're the villain because they did me wrong. And oftentimes, actually, in humanity, we always kind of go back and forth between the victim and villain mentality, but it's not helpful because both of them is either saying, I'm stuck because I'm the victim and I have no way to move forward, or they're the villain and there's no path forward for them, too. Right. And this is now being promoted as empowerment, as self care. But there's nothing empowering about that. If keeping people stuck in pain and a victim mentality is supposed to be empowering, then how are we the weakest, most fragile society to ever exist? Because all it's doing is it's taking your pain and it's placing the blame and the reason for your pain entirely on someone else. And most often, your parents. You label your pain, you attach it to the people who have hurt you. And this, by the way, goes the same way with marriages. It goes the same way with any friendships, relationships. If I feel a kind of way, if I feel hurt, if I feel shameful, if I feel guilt, if I feel uncomfortable, if I feel any anxious, depressed, frustrated, like I can keep going down the list of really negative emotions. If I feel those negative emotions, that means that someone caused them. And if someone caused them, they have to be removed. And the only way for me to not feel those emotions is by having them removed. It's so much more complex and layered than that, right? You cannot attach all of your pain to define somebody else. Because, like I mentioned actually in the first episode, and even the second, and I'm probably going to keep, you guys are going to start to see that it's going to keep going around the same topics, is we make everybody else's behavior. We're in a society that makes everybody's behavior a personal attack. Why? Because we attach our identities, our perspective of self to how other people treat us. And that is the fastest way to make such a fragile society. And it's so much more complex, right? These layered relationships are getting reduced to simple roles, victim and villain. And once you start to adopt that framework, there's nowhere to go from there except further apart. You're stuck in those roles. When you think about therapy language, words like toxic and boundaries and narcissistic and triggers and trauma, it has moved from clinical settings into everyday conversations and arguments and situations. They've been watered down so much that the meaning itself isn't even being used the way that it was originally intended. Right? Right? It's used without nuance. These words stop being tools for healing and start becoming weapons. Weapons that are breaking not just families apart, but actual people, their livelihoods. Because once someone, especially a parent, is labeled as unsafe or abusive or toxic or narcissistic, the conversation ends. You've labeled them as harmful, and I'll always keep having to say it. This is not about real abuse. But oftentimes when people are like, oh, well, if your mom's toxic, you have to cut her off. And I can't even tell you how many times I'm like, okay, so what's toxic mean? They don't even know how to answer that. because now it makes the conversation over. You're the bad guy. And repair doesn't happen when someone is cast as the villain. You don't work through it. You remove them. And socially, cutoff is being applauded. It's being rewarded more than ever in order to protect your peace. You don't owe them anything. Choose yourself. I didn't ask to be born. That is one of the lines that drive me crazy. I didn't ask to be born. I mean, none of us did. But the reality is we want kids and we want to be able to, populate the world. And you oftentimes don't know what it took to raise a child. You were growing alongside that child. You were learning how to navigate life while you're exhausted in survival. By the way, even how it challenges a marriage in that first year of having a child as well, because it's just so new and everyone's running on empty and you're trying to figure things out. Like, there's no manual for becoming a parent. And like I said, there are real situations where distance is necessary. I'm not talking about these, not in any of my episodes or any of that. And I just want to make it so clear, and I'm hoping that I don't have to keep making it very clear, but apparently I do sometimes. But the reality is that's not every story. And that's not a lot of the stories that I'm talking to. In many cases, what's being reinforced is staying stuck in permanent victimhood, where the parent maybe went through an ugly divorce and now the child obviously had to emotionally deal with that, which is very emotionally activating and hard for a child to go through. That doesn't mean that the parents had bad intentions. Or one parent was overly strict, one parent was not as present, one parent was emotionally unavailable because they were in survival mode. All of these things, every single one of them, are going to have effects on a child. It is natural. It's hard. That's what creates the wounds in you. This is also what requires us. And both, by the way, this goes for parents and children. The children that are listening to this, I hope it's going to help you grow in order to reconnect with your parents. And parents who are listening to this, I hope it's going to help you grow to recognize where the growth can be in you in order to better be prepared for that relationship to reconcile. Okay? Being able to build this kind of awareness around yourself is incredibly powerful. And when you're in this kind of victimhood, it can feel powerful because everyone around you validates your pain and it feeds into it. And if someone else is entirely to blame, you don't have to look at your part. You don't have to examine your part or your patterns or your choices. You get to stay stuck. You get to say, I'm the hero, I'm the great person, they're not. But healing requires movement. It's uncomfortable. How often do we hear the expression that growth happens outside of our comfort zones? But yet people are so scared to get out of their comfort zones. And I'm not just talking about jobs. This happens in every day. It happens in relationships. It happens in communication. How many people are uncomfortable having a confrontational conversation, yet that's probably the healthiest thing that is needed. That is probably the one skill that I wish more people every single day spent time on, which I'll definitely do an episode talking about communication, right? But it becomes the blame game, which freezes you in place because it's easier, it's more comfortable. When you think about primal instincts, right? Our bodies, we want a sense of belonging. We don't want to feel like we're vulnerable because we almost feel like we're going to fall behind in the pack. When you think about how our ancestors were, that's why people are so afraid of getting out of their comfort zone, because you literally go into fight or flight mode, not realizing that, wait, there's a way that I can regulate and adapt my body to no longer feel like it's going to fight, flight, or even freeze and fawn, right? People are being taught to cut ties before they've ever even attempted to repair, before they've even understood their own emotions. Nuance is completely disappearing, and forgiveness is now being portrayed as self-betrayal. If you forgive someone, that shows weakness. In no way does that create healthier people or healthier relationships. It actually creates more isolation and more divide and more resentment and more anger and more pain. More unresolved pain that gets carried into every other relationship. And the most important relationship as well, which is the relationship with you. And the tragedy in all of this is that cutting someone off doesn't erase the bond. It just leaves everybody sitting in that pain, and that pain doesn't disappear. It actually starts to spread. Look at the world that we're living in. We're learning emotional language before we actually even have the emotional capacity to understand what this language really means. If someone says something harmful to you, and I'm not talking about insults, I'm talking about constructive criticism, maybe there's some truth in there. And the ego wants to defend because it doesn't want to believe that it's a bad person, right? You don't want to believe that you're a bad person or you're a shitty person or you're a bad parent or you're a bad child nobody wants to believe that. But we have to be able to say, I'm not going to defend myself. I'm just going to sit back and say, is there any truth in there? Is there something that I can work on to be a better person, a better listener, more emotionally mature, whatever it is? There is probably an area of opportunity in every single criticism that you receive from somebody. It doesn't make you a bad person. It actually makes you an incredible person to be able to self-reflect and say there's room for growth here. People are afraid of growth because it requires getting out of your comfort zone. There's no growth that happens out of your comfort zone. There's no healing that happens outside of your comfort zone. And I'm not just talking about practicing healing like meditation and yoga and eating well and all that, because that's incredibly important. But it's the emotional component that is so much more important and so much more powerful, that truly leads to a freer, healthier, happier society. And my goal is to say people need to be healthier and happier. And in order to do that, you need a few things. You need progress. People are genuinely, statistically, scientifically, psychologically happier people when they're progressing and growing as a person. Growing in your work, growing in your purpose, growing in your health, growing in your happiness, growing in your communication, growing in your skills, essentially. When you feel progress, you're naturally a better person. But that also goes into communication. Learning how to better communicate is so important. Learning how to express yourself is so important. The suppression of expression is so incredibly painful nowadays because it actually leads to sickness. It festers inside of you physically and it shows up in physical symptoms, even if it doesn't feel that way. And so when we think about this cutoff culture, when we think about how people are promoting it as self-care, we have to ask ourselves and look around and say, no, it's not. It's creating a weaker society that instead of looking at themselves and saying, what role do I play in this? And how can I better show up for my sake? It's not about everybody else. It's not about who's the bad person, who's the good guy. We're not playing bad cop, good cop here. It's about everyone is navigating their life. Everyone has their perception based on what happened in their upbringing. And everyone is operating from a place of, I don't want to be the bad guy, really. But if we can flip that and say, I'm not a bad guy, but I'm not perfect. Nobody is. How can I get better? How can I show up better? How can I forgive better? How can I understand better? How can I show compassion better? How can I, do better, hear better, speak better, be a better parent, be a better child, be a better believer, strengthen my faith? All of these things, every single one of us can look and say, how can I better myself? And if everyone took the time to do that, we have less time to blame everybody else for our shortcomings, for our insecurities, for our, self-worth and all of the issues that we internally deal with. Because there comes a point where, yes, our parents and our upbringing definitely influenced how we see ourselves, how we see the world, how we speak about ourselves, how we speak to other people. That's 100% true. But there comes a point where you start to say it is no longer their job and it's a me job. It becomes a me thing to grow through, to improve on, and to say I have full control over my life. And I talk about this in so much detail, you guys. If you guys have checked out my programs, check out my website, my YouTube, all of those. I really talk about all the different components because you could see how there's different components that feed into this. So definitely go and check it out. But I want to end this episode on one note, and that is, if you're operating from a place of pain, if you're operating from a place of blame, if you're operating from a place of shame, we have to flip that and say, this is not the healthiest place to operate from. I need to operate from a place of power. And real power means I can stand firm in who I am and still keep people around me that might have previously activated me. But in order to truly step in my power, I have to say, I know exactly who I am. I know exactly what I bring. I know exactly my worth. And that changes how you walk into relationships.